In this video, we'll take a look at the source directory, which was generated for us, and talk about all of the files inside and what they do, what their purpose is for, and how you can modify them or configure them to your heart's content. So if we open up the source directory and we take a look at index.js, we can see this is the entry point into our node.js application. We're bringing in logger, we're bringing in our feathers app, which is defined in a separate file. We're bringing in the port variable. So if you remember back to our configuration, if we look in the default.json, we see that port is set to 3030. So anywhere in your code, if you see app.get, it's actually retrieving that configuration to use. And so in this case, it's going to retrieve it. And if we're in the development environment, that port will be 3030. Awesome. We do app.listen to start the server up. We're listening for any unhandled rejections. And when it's listening, we just log to the console the host and the port of where it's listening. Now, if we take a look at the app file, which is required in here, we can see a lot of what's going on. So once you look at this, if you've ever built an Express application, this is going to look very similar. We're bringing in a lot of middlewares, a lot of packages, to basically bootstrap and configure our Feathers application. So I'm bringing in the core path module. I'm bringing in serve favicon which is a middleware, which will serve up favicons. I'm bringing in a compressed middleware, helmet, cores. We have our logger, and then we're bringing in the core Feathers packages. So we're bringing in Feathers directly. We're bringing in the configuration package, which is the one that handles reading in this JSON file and exposing it on our application. We're bringing in Express and Socket.io, but you will notice that these are coming from Feathers.js. So these are just lightweight wrappers around those underlying libraries to basically make them work well with Feathers.js. You can see we're bringing in some of our own files and modules, which I'll talk about in a second, but it's essentially bringing in those folders. We're bringing in the authentication file, which I'll talk about in a second, and then we create our Express application. So you'll notice we invoke Express, and Express is actually coming from Feathers.js Express, and then we pass in a new Feathers application. So this is essentially how we let Express know that this is a Feathers application, and we'll basically be able to do Feathers things and Express things all at the same time. We can see line 24 here, we're bringing in that configuration. We're using app.configure. Later on, I'll talk about what app.configure really is, but we can see we're invoking configuration, and under the hood, that's actually bringing in these JSON files and making all of those configurations available to the rest of the app. Next up, we are setting up all of our middlewares. So we're using Helmet, which sets some secure headers, Cores, which sets our cross-origin resource sharing headers. We have a compression middleware. We have our body parsing middleware, both for JSON bodies and form data bodies. We're serving up a favicon, and then we're just doing a static serve on the slash path. Next up, we're setting up our providers, and these essentially enable a particular protocol that our Feathers.js application will be available on. So this first one enables express.rest, which essentially allows our Feathers application to be used as a RESTful API. And the next one enables Socket.io, which allows our Feathers.js application to be used over sockets in a real-time application. Next up, we can see how we're configuring many different things. So we're saying app.configure, we're passing in our middleware, which we'll talk about. We're passing in authentication, which we'll talk about. We're passing in services, which we'll talk about as well. And we're passing in channels, which we'll talk about as well. We lastly do some error handling. So Feathers adds a not found middleware to the Express package that we're bringing in, and an error handler middleware, which gives us nicer errors and a not found message, which is a bit nicer than the built-in Express one. We are registering all of our app level hooks. In a future video, we'll talk about what hooks are. And lastly, we're exporting our app, which can be used, and which we saw was required in index.js to actually start up the application. So that's it for what's happening in app.js. In the next video, I'll dive into what's actually happening in all of these other folders and the authentication file.